My name is Mary Fitz, and while we're sharing with Sheila, who's on family vacation in Washington State, and in reverence to Kohler Arsenal, we take a vow of reverence to. We co-facilitate the interfaith committee of the KCN Climate Coalition. The interfaith committee members are representatives of faith communities who come together to share ideas and develop educational programs focusing on healing the earth. The KCN Climate Coalition is comprised of people working together to face the challenges of the climate crisis across the world. I want to introduce Val Nelson. Raise your hand.
Might have a little bit more. Yeah, you can't hear very well.
Okay, I'm sure that's good. I want to introduce Val Nelson, who is a member of the Interfaith Committee on the board of the Lanesville Community Center and of the organization committee of the KCN Climate Coalition, and a genius grant writer. So Val wrote a grant. We received a large amount of money from NOAA over 2 years, and it's allowing us to have this program here. This program is lovingly devoted to the memory of Dr. Judith Olson, a member of St. Paul's, a board member of the Lanesville Community Center, an international expert in the field of reconciliation, traveling often to the Balkans, and at the time of her death, a member of the faculty of the BU School of Theology. And she was a cherished friend to many of us in the audience today. Both Judith's husband and her friend Donna prepared a beautiful tribute to Judith that was distributed as you came in today. Judith was an advocate for peace and justice in the organization she served, as well as the larger community. She was a skilled facilitator in both conflict resolution and social change initiatives. Judith brought students to Canada to witness the process and testimonies reported by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. This effort was a huge effort to address the problems of the Indian schools. Judith had a deep interest in Indigenous spirituality, and it is most fitting today's speaker, David, reading is dedicated to her name. After David's presentation, we are serving cranberry crumble and coffee. The crumble recipe, which is downstairs if you want a coffee, was developed by tribal elder Gladys Willis of the Wampanoag tribe of Martha's Vineyard and published in Heather Abbott's book, In God We Trust. Just to let you know, if you need a bathroom, you go down the stairs, first floor on the right in the undercroft, and further at the back of the undercroft, there are more bathrooms. Thank you. Now it's going to introduce David.
So thank you, Marion, and on behalf again of the KCN Climate Coalition and the Lanesville Community Center both, we're grateful to honor Judith Olson, who's was a tremendous member of the Lanesville community, so we appreciate that. And I really welcome all of you. We're delighted to have you here. Coalition Interfaith Committee is particularly pleased to be able to have our first Indigenous speaker about spiritual ways of living with the planet and with each other. So just very briefly, I think I've given all of you his actual bio, but I'll just tell you why in my conversations I enjoy them so much is that he is the Historic Preservation Officer for the Wampanoag tribe. For the Wampanoag Tribe Historic Preservation Officer, and also has been a member of the Mashpee Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board, and a commission member on the Cape Cod Commission. And so what he brings then is understanding both indigenous ways and his upbringing in the tribe and history, and also a deep knowledge of governance in Cape Cod at least. And in that pursuit, he has told me he has brought the values and the ways and perspectives of the Wampanoag tribe into the process of government on Cape Cod. So it's a remarkable combination of background that he's bringing with us today. And his education in planning and history is pretty remarkable as well. So we really, please welcome David Whedon, who drove from Mashpee on Cape Cod here to
Hello.
Hello.
Is that good? Kui Boston, Natasa Winata, Inane, Mutumas, Messapi Wampanoag. Hello, everyone. My name is David Whedon. My traditional name is Winata Inane, and that means one who walks alone. In our way, we introduce ourselves in our traditional language to honor our language and customs and ways. And so I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their day to come and attend this presentation, and I hope that everyone walks away feeling like they have learned enough about our ways to introduce them into the co-stewardship of our coastal environments and ecosystems. So, I'm an enrolled member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. When we say enrolled member, there's folks that are descendants by blood, and then there's enrolled members. Enrolled members are active members within the tribe. I serve as everyone has said previously, I serve as the tribe's historic preservation officer, and some of my other roles and responsibilities are serving on the Board of Selectmen. I'm also elected as a tribal council member, and I've served on the Cape Cod Commission, a regional regulatory body, since 2017, and as a Native American representative on that development regulatory authority. I want to begin with a little bit of history on the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, who we are. And so, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe are one of the original 69 tribes within the southeastern Massachusetts region. Originally, the 69 tribes were all self-governing entities that worked together within the Wampanoag Nation. The Wampanoag Nation, when we talk about nationhood within Native American aspects, we look at the language families, and the language families are what dictate the nation, and the cultural influences are also incorporated into the language and teachings and customs. And so when I say Wampanoag language, all of the woodland tribes within the eastern United States and up into Canada and south as far as Maryland, and then I forget the points west, but around the Great Lakes, they're also Algonquin speaking. So it's the largest language family within the country of the United States and Canada, and some people are probably familiar with some of the other language families, Siouan, the Inuit, and then the Navajo and Southwest tribes have their own language families as well. Algonquin, so the difference between the Algonquin language is the dialects, and so within respective to tribal nations, we each have our own dialect. Mashpee and Wampanoag people are an L dialect, and which is uniquely different than some of our neighbors, the Nipmuc Nation, the Narragansett to our south, and tribes north in the Wabanaki Confederacy. Our language, we can speak to one another and learn and understand what each other is saying, but there's slight differences based on the dialect change. And there's even within the nation of the Wampanoag, there's slight subtle changes between the Islanders and the mainland tribes as well. So the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, we are a first contact tribe. And so our relationship with the imposed governments stems back to the early 1600s. A bit of background, John Eliot was propagating gospel to a lot of the southeastern tribes in Massachusetts, and he also worked with a gentleman by the name of Richard Bourne. Richard Bourne was predominantly working in our area of the Upper Cape region and Bourne, Plymouth area as well. And so he was working with the local tribes, and Mashpee as a collective, the villages that were within the Upper Cape region, some of them chose to entertain the idea of listening to the gospel and learning from it, and incorporating the propagation of gospel into our ways and life ways and spirituality. And so with that, our Old Indian Meeting House is the oldest Indian church in the country, and it's the oldest church on Cape Cod. It was built in 1684, and it was originally built on Bryant's Neck, a peninsula that sticks out into Santua Pond, and then it was moved in 1713 over to its present location at 410 Meeting House Road, and has actively been used ever since. It went through some years where it wasn't taken care of and was neglected a little bit, and it's gone through some renovations. One of the most recent ones was completed in 2010. We did a major overhaul on it and restored it, jacked the building, and put a full foundation, monitoring mechanicals and things to preserve and protect that structure. It is listed on the National Register as a historic property, and it's a structure that is integral to our lifeways, our shared history and culture and heritage. And so when we attend the service and things and activities within that space, it brings a lot of comfort to us because our ancestors have practiced have met in there for various purposes, including religious purposes, as well as meeting prior to going to town meetings and things. And so if the walls could talk, they'd have a lot to say. And so it's something that's cherished to us. We do actively use it. There's a small group that meets there on Sunday and has service. There are a few tribal members that participate in that congregation. And we like to also use it and make it available for funerals, weddings, and other special events as well. So in the early periods, Mashpee was the first established by the local chiefs. John Eliot, through his missionaries, came, and the path for assimilation was that the colonists quickly started to outnumber us as they came over on the Mayflower. And after the first year, they were coming thousands and thousands each year. And that only increased exponentially as the years progressed. And so, because of that, they wanted to put the Native Americans in a district. And so they established the Mashpee Plantation as a praying Indian town. Originally, there were 19 praying Indian towns within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And of those 19 praying Indian towns, there's only 4 or so that remain today. Mashpee is one. Aquina, our sister tribe on Martha's Vineyard, and Gay Head tribe, we call them Aquina, the traditional name. And we're the only 2 that have survived and persevered as strong communities enough to be able to successfully navigate the federal recognition process. And so the other tribes within the Commonwealth that are still remnants of praying Indian towns are the Nipmuc and also the Heron Pond. And then there's some other bands that are at varying levels of state recognition, although the state doesn't have a process, so we're not sure what that means. Mashpee, as a prairie Indian town, it was established by our local chiefs, came together, and Chief Quachatasset was the elder chief and senior chief, and well respected within the Upper Cape region. And he and other chiefs got together and collectively set aside lands. It was a verbal agreement with boundaries and extents for the praying Indians of Mashpee. And so they established the Mashpee Plantation. Then later on, in the early 1800s, Mashpee became an Indian district. And then the path for assimilation was that the imposed government wanted us to learn the colonial form of governance successfully enough to be able to manage ourselves in colonial New England form of governance with town meetings and such and select boards. And so with that, as we advanced through the plantation period and into the district period, we didn't blindly adopt the colonial ways, the imposed ways. It's always been, and still is, a hybrid where you have half of your tribe wants to hang on to our ancient ways and continue on our original teachings, and then another portion of that half is more progressive and wants to learn and adopt the Christian ways because they see the trajectory that we're becoming outnumbered and our ways need to be incorporated into this new life ways in governance. And so that's always been the case. The reluctance to blindly walk away from your original teachings has played out through our history and still affects us today in our decision making. And even within our tribal council today, you still have that divide of some of the people who are progressive and want to look at economics and things and kind of so focused on that. But then we always retain some of our traditional people on the tribal council to create that balance. And balance is something that you'll hear probably quite often throughout my presentation. And so going forward, in the 1800s, there was, in the early beginnings, Harvard University was assigned the responsibility of appointing overseers. And the overseers were very oppressive. One of the earliest overseers was Gideon Hawley. Gideon Hawley was oppressive in his own way. Then there was Crockers, was a recognized name that were appointed as overseers. And then Phineas Fish. Phineas Fish is probably the most notorious of all of the overseers. And Mashpee had one-room schoolhouses from early on as well, as many other praying Indian towns had. And so they were trying to teach us so that we could learn the new ways of the colonial imposed government. And with that, Mashpee quickly became able to write our own petitions and things. And so for folks that do research, there's a lot of petitions out there that Mashpee wrote that reflect and kind of are in contrast to some of the bigoted, descriptive narratives of the Indians of the Commonwealth, where we talk about Indians as though we were lesser than and not as intelligent. And folks that may be familiar with the Carlisle Indians group, their mission was, kill the savage, save the child. And so our people were listening, learning, adopting Christianity, incorporating spirituality imposed by the colonial governments. And with that, our petitions, when you read over them, they're very eloquent, they're very craftfully written. The penmanship is meticulous and beautiful, and even now today, reflecting back. And so our people were trying to play by the colonial rule and rules, and the varying rules throughout our history. But equal justice is something that's never played out for us. And so Phineas Fish, the Old Indian Meeting House was first established so that it was for the purpose of propagating gospel to the Indian community of Marshall. Mashpee and as a plantation, and then later a district. And with that, Phineas Fish wasn't allowing the natives of Mashpee to actually participate in the congregation. It was predominantly outsiders from surrounding communities that were participating as a congregation. And so at that point in time, this is about 1832, and at that time there was a gentleman that came to our area. His name was William Avis, and there was another gentleman that grew up in the community that was from the community, Blind Joe Amos. William Avis was a half African American, half Eastern Pequot, and Blind Joe Amos was born and raised in Mashpee and was legally blind. His claim to fame was that his mom would read the Bible to him ever since he was a young child, and so he was able to articulate and recite whole verses from the Bible committed to memory. And so he very effectively connected with the people of Mashpee in his sermons. And so because the Phineas Fish wasn't allowing tribal members to participate in the congregation, Blind Joe had assembled a Baptist group over at a large oak tree pretty close to where our Baptist church is today. And they started, him and the activist and educator William Apis, together they created the Mashpee Baptist Society. And still to this day, the Baptist denomination is still the largest attended denomination of the churches in the area by the community of Mashpee, our tribal members. And so with that, they started to, William Apis saw what was going on with all the impressions of the overseer. And so one of the big things that he identified was that Harvard was providing a salary to Phineas Fish, and yet Phineas Fish, they even allocated land to Phineas Fish for the purpose of building a homestead for he and his family. And the same thing had been done to some of the previous overseers, Gideon Hawley, the Crockers, and those families still have property in Mashpee today, and some of their homes are historic properties as well within the Mashpee area. And so Phineas Fish was selling wood that was a natural resource that was for the tribe. It was within the boundaries of the Mashpee plantation. And so William Apis said, you know, he's not allowed to sell your wood. Those resources, that money should be going to the tribe and not for his own personal gain. He already gets a salary. And so he got us wound up. A few of our people had gone over to where he was selling the wood, and he had pre-measured cartloads of wood that people would pull up and load into their cart and take away and after paying him. And so a few of our men got together and tipped over the carts, and they got arrested. And so the case ended up going before the Mass General Court. The Mass General Court remanded it back to the local magistrate that just so happened to be one of Phineas Fish's parishioners. And they ended up getting thrown in jail for 30 days as punishment. And so following that incident, there was a gentleman by the name, we weren't done with it, and so we wanted to fight it and litigate further. And so we went back to the general court to fight it further, and at that point in time, there was a gentleman by the name of Benjamin F. Howell, who was raised and born over in the adjacent community of Barnstable. He attended Brown University and got his degree in law, and he actually, it was the first time in our history that we had legal representation before the general court. And so in 1834, he went before the general court and pled our case, and he successfully advocated for, Mashpee wanted to be autonomous and self-governing. And this is another thing that resonates throughout my presentation and still today with the tribe, is one of our main goals, is that autonomy, the right to self-govern as a people and to practice our ways as we see fit. And so another instance was that Mashpee, I said, was very progressive. We were progressive enough where in 1795, I believe, it was, we had a select board, And when you compare select boards to kind of the way we govern now, the tribal councils, it is very similar. And so as early as 1795, we were governing ourselves, but it wasn't solely Native Americans that comprised the select board. There was two individuals who were non-Native that were appointed as the treasurer and the clerk. And then the other three of the 5-member board were Native Americans and elected officials. And so that lasted for about 10 years, and then they took it back and went back to the overseers being the higher authority within the district. And so going back to 1834, Benjamin Hallett, and throughout the early parts of our history, churches served as bodies of politics within the community. So a lot of decisions were made in the church environment. And so Mashpee and the Old Indian Meeting House and the congregation was recognized as a body of politics. So for self-governance purposes, I mentioned that. And so through our Old Indian Meeting House, we advocated for full control of the Old Indian Meeting House, and we wanted our own self-governing body and go back to the select board way of self-governance. And so in 1834, the Mass General Court actually heard the case. Benjamin Hallett pled and ruled in our favor and appointed the select board. And so at that point in time, 1834, we were we reinstituted the select board self-governance mechanism, similar to municipalities within the Commonwealth today. And so they were all tribal members at that period of time. And so that lasted throughout the remaining part of the district period, the select board, and we were self-governing. And so I don't know how many folks are familiar with, let me dial back. In our efforts to be self-governing, in 1763, there was another gentleman that was actually a Mohegan, and he had come up, he was teaching within our one-room schoolhouses. His name was Reuben Cognew. Reuben Cognew had a very interesting life, and some of his adventures were very notable. And so when he came to Mashpee, he also, similar to William Apis, saw everything that was going on in the oppression that we were facing as a community. And so he took, and with some other the elders and officials within the tribal structure, social structure, they wrote a petition to King George, and he and 13 others actually got on a vessel to go to England and actually bend the ear of the king and advocate for our self-governance. And so this is just prior to 1763. And so it took a series of 3 vessels to get over there. The first vessel didn't believe he was a freeman, and so they enslaved him. He went to the Caribbean and successfully talked his way out of that and the others. And they got on another vessel, and so there was 3 altogether, and they ended up making their way to England and getting the ear of the king, having time with him, and advocated and delivered the petition written by our own people to advocate for self-governance and not be under the jurisdiction of the colonial courts in Plymouth Colony. And so 1763, they achieved self-governance. 1795, they imposed a select board, although 2 are non-native. 1834, it's been taken away, and we advocate for ourselves to have self-governance again. 1834, we win that case through the efforts of Benjamin Hallett. So then, around 1863, I believe, folks may be familiar that follow Indian policy and canons of construction of Indian policy and Indian law may be familiar with the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was, Senator Dawes was from Massachusetts, and he imposed, he was the one that used the Dawes Act and incorporated that, so it affected tribal nations across the country. But much of the Indian policy and Indian law stems from Massachusetts and colonial New England's way of managing the Indians. And so Mashpee, similar to a lot of other Massachusetts tribal communities, Mashpee was advocating for itself, And, but the overseers and the other folks like Harvard, there's a lot of written material that's in their archives that it talks about how, you know, it was a trial to force to assimilate the Indian praying Indian towns. And in their correspondence between the overseers and the deans of Harvard, they talk very negatively of the Indians as they're stupid, they're lazy, they're not productive citizens in their eyes. Culturally, in our way, we only take what we need. And so if you have a roof over your head, clothes on your back, and you're a good person and generous and kind-hearted, then life is good. And in our way, the Creator put everything here for us to live. He put medicine, He put food, He put materials and plants and things for us to make homes and clothing. And so we're appreciative of that. Being here in New England, we didn't have a whole lot to fight over because we didn't have to chase the buffalo. It wasn't like a soul food source out here. There was an abundance with the coastal regions and all the different bodies of water that nurture us. And so, you know, we didn't have a whole lot to fight over, especially within the nations. And so we collectively shared those resources. And we didn't own land. The idea of land ownership is foreign to us. You know, drawing imaginary lines, nothing respects that other than human beings. Those lines are arbitrary in the cosmology and worldviews of Native Americans. You know, the resources are there as a gift. We don't call them resources. They're gifts of the Creator. And so with that, in our original teachings, those gifts have to be appreciated and always respected. In our way, we look at the land as we borrow it from our future generations. And so in that philosophy, you know, you want to honor your ancestors and all the efforts they did to ensure that you're able to practice your life ways sustainably, so that we can appreciate them, and we have the same responsibility to do that for the future generations, for our children and our children's children. Commonly across Indian country, you hear 7 generations. We reflect on 7 generations of the past, and we honor and try to ensure 7 generations forward. And so that's the mindset and guiding principles of Native American way of life. And so 1836-ish, the lands up until that point of Mashpee were held in common and they were shared. And so the colonial Massachusetts government wanted to get the Native Americans to be more productive citizens, and with the hopes of eventually taxing them when the district becomes a municipality. And so that's how they gauge, productive citizens, is how much is your worth. The early census information essentially figured out how many men you could muster for war, also how much wealth, how much income you derived on an annual basis for the purposes of taxation, and then owning property, like what property you own. So as within the Mashpee district, the land was held collectively up until 1836. 1836-ish, they imposed the allotment period. And so they broke up the lands within the Mashpee and they distributed them amongst the families, with every person over the age of 21 getting 60 acres. And that was in the hopes of each family would be able to create generational wealth, self-determined generational wealth, by what they invested into the land through their work. And at that period, agrarian culture was the way of making a living. And so they wanted you to be productive farmers. And if you weren't farming it, then you could lease land. So dial it back again. When Chief Quashatasset signed that original title, or he framed the title and deed verbally, 50 years later, Richard Bourne thought it was prudent to put the terms and conditions of that and the boundaries to paper. And so they put it in writing and then took it to the colonial court and filed it with the colonial court. 100 years later than that, in in 1795-ish, Richard Bourne's grandson actually ratified that title and deed through the colonial court system, making it a formal legal binding document. Much like all the other legal documents that created the municipalities within the southeastern Mass through and Massachusetts in general, through the colonial courts of the Plymouth Bay Colony and the Mass Bay Colony. And so in that title and deed that was ratified, the language didn't change in the various iterations. And in that title and deed, it was, the land was to be held by the people of Mashpee, the proprietors, that being the tribe, and their children's children in perpetuity, never to be taxed, sold from, alienated from, and those were some of the terms of the title and deed. Unless there was a vote held at a meeting specifically for the purpose to determine that, disenfranchising land, and the vote would require a unanimous decision. This is the words, I'm paraphrasing, in the title and deed that was signed by our local chiefs. And so Mashpee was created by local chiefs, not by colonial government. It was our chiefs that came together and said, we set aside 50 square miles for the Native Americans of Mashpee. And that was comprised of a few different small villages, Ashumet, Walkway, Papanesset, Katuit, Santuit, Mashpee, and so those villages comprise Mashpee. 50 square miles encompass what's now Barnstable, Katuit, Santuit, Walkway is now a part of Falmouth. And so local towns were, right from the beginning, they were coming after land. And so in the allotment period, they allotted the land. That never worked out because, as I said, our way is that we only take as much as we need. So we only grew enough food to feed our families. Traditionally, in our culture, for a family of 5, you grow an acre of land, that's enough food to last you throughout the year. We put our half of the food in storage pits, and we would bury it when we left our summer camps that were closer to the water, and then we would take the other half with us to our winter homes that were further inland. And so that had always been our way. And so, we only grew enough to provide for ourselves. We bartered with other families, so somebody would grow something and then families would just, trade so that we could all eat. And Mashpee never experienced famine or anything like that. We were always well fed. Food was something we didn't worry about. So after the allotments in 1869, the state wanted to incorporate the town of Mashpee. And in doing so, they held a meeting per the title and deed, the conditions of the title and deed. That vote failed, 48 to 52, and yet the state still, along with all the other remaining 19 praying Indian towns, they disestablished the Indian districts, or praying Indian towns. They converted them and incorporated them into municipalities. And so in doing that, that essentially was erasure, and it extinguished that relationship of the Indian tribe, because now they were municipalities. They were still Indian towns because the population was predominantly Indian. But for the purposes of being an isolated group of collective individuals and unique as a community, they were municipalities. And at that point, it removed all the other barriers so that land then could be sold off and leased or alienated from, and it could also be taxed. And so after 1869 and 1970, the town was incorporated. From there, Mashpee still remained an Indian town. The population at that period, jumping back, in 1600s when the Indian plantation was first established, there was roughly 258 people, and the area that was allotted to us by the local chiefs was 50 square miles. You do the math and the ratio, how much land it takes to sustain a community. based on those numbers. Jump forward, 1870, the town's still predominantly native, 90%, 85% of the population is still Mashpee Wampanoag people and their spouses. Dial it back again. Around the 1700s, we're coming up on the Revolutionary War, so I want to touch on that for a moment. The Revolution, when they came to solicit people and muster rolls, try to advocate people to participate in the Revolution, they came to us and they sold us the same bill of goods that are captured in the Constitution. And so the promises of freedom, equality, equal justice, all those things was the selling point. Now, mind you, I said that Reuben Cogman had just gone over to England and advocated for us to be removed from under the colonial authority. And so 1763, shortly prior to the Revolutionary War, the king granted us a higher level of autonomy. And then in 1776, we're asked to fight on the side of the colonists. That had to be a hard decision. And we decided to fight for the same reasons the colonists did for all those freedoms. We're still waiting for those freedoms to happen. So with that, going back, 1870, we ran the town as an Indian town up until in 1960s. Large developers started to come in. So because we had land, each family had the 60 acres remnants from the allotments, we were land rich and money poor. As bureaucracy grows, so does taxation. And so the tax burden started to climb as we developed our schools and infrastructure within the town. But the tribe held all the positions. All the school system, the police, the fire, the town governance was all managed by Mashpee tribal members. And so Mashpee successfully remained as an Indian community up until the 1960s, and then large developers started to come in and buy a lot of land. And that's when things started to shift, and eventually led to a lawsuit in '76 when our elders felt as though the egregious development was affecting our environment in our hunting and fishing areas, and they had the vision to see the long-term impacts, and so they sued for the remaining lands that were undeveloped within the town of Mashpee to be turned back over to the tribe based on that original title and deed. And so we went to court, and the judge instructed the jury to determine whether or not we were or weren't a tribe. In that case, the jury found that at various points throughout our history, we were a tribe, we weren't a tribe, we weren't a tribe. At that particular time, in 1978, we weren't a tribe by federal definition. So they imposed the definition from the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, into a deed that was established in 1695, I believe, is when the title and deed was originally signed. And so with that, we lost that land suit. Up until that point, we didn't see reason to go for federal recognition because we're a first contact tribe. We've been interacting with the various forms of imposed government since the first people got off the boat. And so why should we go through a federal recognition process? So after we lost that land suit, we actually went back and filed a petition for federal recognition. That process is supposed to take 10 years or so, ideally. But what we found was that they really didn't have a process. And so we navigated that. It took us 33 years to do it, but we ended up successfully getting federal recognition in 2007. Following 2007, we quickly submitted a petition for land into trust. But what the town had done from '78 to 2007, they knew we were still a tribe. They knew we were a tribal community. They knew we were going to get federal recognition eventually, and subsequently land into trust. So they egregiously developed as much land as possible, locked anything else up in conservation, and it was very, it was done with purpose. And so when we filed our petition for land into trust, there wasn't a whole lot of land to go after. And so essentially what we have for land and trust now is 300 acres. There's 150 in Mass Street and there's 170, so 320 acres. The 170 is in Taunton. It's for economic development purposes essentially and other needs of tribal governance. But 150 we have collectively in the town of Mass Street, a place that we've called home for thousands of years. In our original teachings, our stories tell us that we've been here since time immemorial, is how we like to put it. Archaeology as a science confirms that we've been here for 12,000 years. Much has changed and we've persevered through a lot over 12,000 years. This year I want to show you a picture of our traditional home. The traditional home is called a wicue. This particular one is called a roundhouse. Other folks are probably familiar with the term wigwam. So this is what the inside of a wigwam would look like. You would have a small cooking fire inside. Folks would lay on the beds. Not the best picture because with hunting and things, we'd have a lot of hides accumulated that would make the beds much more comfortable than just the poles that you see there. The mats that are colorful are bulrush mats. They're woven out of bulrush. It's a plant, a marsh plant, and it's found in vegetated wetlands. And that we weave, dye and weave, and sew, well, it's not woven, it's sewn. And so our women make those over the winter, and they line the walls. So they help with the airflow. Having a central fire, central heat is still the best efficient way of heating a home. So in our homes, they were roughly 9 to 10 feet tall. The diameter would be roughly, this one's about 30 foot, I think, and then it's about 15, 16 feet wide. So they're oval shaped. We call it a roundhouse based on how many fires it takes to heat it. And so as it gets bigger, Nice Coteau would be a house of 2 fires, Nice being 2. And so in this image, it's a summer home. As you look at the top, the mats are covered, mat covering is made out of cat nine tails. So the cat nine tails have like the blade of grass piece, and so they're sewn together. They're concave in shape, they're spongy, they constrict when they're dry, and then they swell when they're wet. And so they act as a bunch of mini gutters. And so we sew those mats as well. They don't last too long, you have to make them each year. And so we would harvest the materials in the fall, take them with the materials with us to our winter homes, and then make the mats over the winter collectively in the homes over the winter. And then in the wintertime, we would live in a bark covered home. Typically, the materials we use for that are ash, poplar, hemlock. Wabanaki relatives use birch bark. Hard to find those materials nowadays that trees big enough where you can get full sheets. Less seams, the better, much like shingling and modern construction. And so that's a typical home. We would sleep 2 to a bed. Our families were extended families, so some homes you would go down to micro families where you would have 5 or so, and then live more communally in winter months to share collectively the resources. Because in the end of the winter, times get really hard, and sometimes it's hard to find things to eat. But so when I spoke of land grabs, one of the initial land grabs was shortly after the Marsh Street plantation was established. I said there was 50 square miles that was held in perpetuity for the tribe. Quickly, surrounding towns started to try to get that land, and so Chief Pop Name was from Grand Island in Austin, and he was a senior chief within our social structure. And so the colonists got him, they took him and invited him to a meeting, and then they liquored him up. And in some of the recordings, primary source material, they actually say that he was kept captive and fed liquor until he was willing to sign. And so as a result of that first purchase, he sold off Santuit and Katuitt to the Barnstable community. And so that was the first land grab, and that diminished the town of Mashpee extents significantly. Later on, surrounding towns like Sandwich annexed north of Mashpee. The original Mashpee went as far as Spectacle Pond, and there's physical descriptive boundaries within the original title and deed that you can still look at to see where those outer extents were identified. And so it encompassed all of what's Waquoit Village in Falmouth now. It encompassed all of parts of Sandwich all the way to Spectacle Pond and Chase Road to the north. And then it's a significant part of Sandwich. And then the Santuit and Katuitt, it went all the way to the Katuitt River, which we identified. Nowadays they call it the Marston's Mills River. And so it was significantly larger than what's there today. Now, today, the Mashpee is essentially 25 square miles. So it's half of the land of what was originally set aside in 1600s prior to local chiefs. So, you know, it's always been about the land. As colonization took place, they confined us to a small boundary, the plantation district, town of Mashpee, similar to all the other praying Indian towns throughout New England. And then, as population grew and the demand for more land continued, it remained an issue of needing more land. Colonization, there's an insatiable desire for more land, and it's constant, and it still affects us today, as we all know, and affordability gets more and more challenging. So with us, the struggle is reflected in our history, is that land has always been an issue. As I said, it's foreign to us to actually own land, but now we have to be mindful of it because we won't have a place to call home, and we have to continue to fight for land as a people. The 17 This is an image showing some of the praying Indian towns. I said there were 19. These are some of the praying Indian communities. This is an image from the 17th century. Just so you have some folks don't realize it, but some of the praying Indian towns, Yarmouth was a praying Indian town, Chatham was a praying Indian town, Heron Pond, there was other areas as well. The praying Indian towns have a square box with the cross on top. The triangles are major English settlements, and then the round circles are Indian reservations, or that were originally created as plantations. So as I said, coastal living is something that's essential to us. For us, it's a significant part of our life race. We only take what we need. In our way, we look at all life as being important. We understand the interconnectedness between life. And so we cannot put ourselves higher than any other being. And so when we refer to rivers and ponds, we talk about it. Even the land under our feet, we refer to it as our mother. That's a sign of respect, and it's a way of thinking that conditions you as a culture and as a people to understand the nurturing relationship of the land. And so the waters we also refer to in that way as it's a feminine and it's a nurture. And then sometimes the stars and sky are grandfathers, and the sun are more grandfathers. So it's that familiarity with family, so you identify these things and connect with these things as a family relationship and dynamic. And so that's to ensure the respect is given to those things. Like I said, seasonally we live by the coast in summer months because our diet consisted predominantly our diet change with the season. So our calendar year is 13 moons. We go by a lunar cycle. And so at each season, there's different activities that we do. In the spring, we welcome the fish. Our new year begins with the coming of the heron. And the heron are essential to us. We use them to help fertilize our crops. We use them to smoke so that we have them throughout the remaining of the year and preserve them in that way. And then during the summer months, you're eating more shellfish and fish. In the winter, in the fall, you're catching more fowl. And then in the winter, you're eating furry animals, larger game and such. And so, as I said, during the summer months, your growing season, it comes with the blossoming of the leaves and the coming of the heron, mark our new year, and our growing season is quickly approaching. So you prepare the fields. In our way, the women are the ones that do the farming because they're nurturers. They have that giving spirit and take care of things. And so you want that kind of medicine to go into your foods, and when they grow, they put that nurturing spirit into the food so that we get the full nourishment of the plants. The men are life takers, we're warriors, so we go out and do the hunting and killing, and don't mix the two so that, the women have their roles and responsibilities. Although in our way, the women are looked up to, and we've had women sachems and leaders. It wasn't the same with colonists. The man was the power figure in the family dynamic and the governance as well. But in our way, we recognize the value of the women as nurturers. They raise our future chiefs, they raise our future leaders, and so they have purpose and importance equal to the men. In our way, we also have the way we collect knowledge and retain knowledge is there's pockets in different societies within our culture, and so it's a collective knowledge within that group, subgroup. And so we had medicine societies and warrior societies and spiritual societies. The medicine man, spiritual leaders were part of the medicine society. And so that's comprised of your healers, your medicine people, your folks that understood well-being. And so on a spiritual level and things like that. And so that's how we retain knowledge collectively. And, our lifeways is comprised of the intergenerational relationships. And so the women, we live communally. And so the elders looked after the young, and there was a lot of interaction. So oral history is essential to our way of life. We didn't write things down, put it to paper. We didn't have books. And so the passing on of information was done generationally by that intimate relationship and being around, interacting with your grandmas and your aunties. In our way, you may hear us talk about aunties, and it's a sign of respect for a tribal elder. It may not be blood relation, but you have a connection with them, so it's, in our way, we're all cousins within the tribal dynamic. And so we communicate with each other and refer to elders and things as a sign of respect as auntie and things, or grandma, and if they're, an elder person. But the children are taught that from a young age. Some of the different things that we ate were, we ate raccoon, we ate, was a delicacy, skunk was a delicacy, squirrel, rabbit, wild turkeys, deer, black bear, moose, whatever. One gentleman within our communities, his father was chief, and families avid hunters and subsistence lifeway, practiced subsistence lifeways for generations, and still today they feed the community. And he said we used to travel as far as the Ohio River Valley on hunting expeditions throughout historically. The other thing is that you have a close relationship with your environment, so you want to be intimately involved to be able to understand the plants. As I said, Creator put everything here to be able to sustain us. And so with that, you have to know which plants are harmful, which plants are medicines. Typically, he puts, if there's something that will hurt you, there's something that will cure you right next to you. And so our relationship with the environment is close enough where as things have changed over those 12,000 years that archaeology confirms we've been here, so much has changed. It's being close to the environment to understand it enough and having that relationship to hear what the environment's trying to tell you and learn from it in a way where you incorporate those plants and herbs and things into your lifeways for medicine purposes, for food, for nourishment, for lodging and clothing. So some current threats, much like up here, I read over some of your materials on the table that the coalition has been working on. Mashpee's going through the same things. Our water quality is horrendous. Mashpee, there was a reference that said, "Nowhere have I seen subsistence practiced so effortlessly than in Mashpee." So Mashpee, the word is derived from Masipi. Masipi means great water place. And so our ponds, our waters, our bays, they were great waters. They provided, they were very abundant. White Bay was one of the most productive abatements north of the Chesapeake Bay. And so now White Bay and Pompanesett Bay are becoming eutrophic at accelerated rates. Nothing's going to live in them. And so all this is as a result of egregious development, greed, lack of foresight, lack of regulation, lack of governance. If we were to do a report card for the effectiveness of regulations that have been implemented throughout the Commonwealth's history or the federal government's history, they would fail across the board, when it comes to water quality and environment. And so recognizing that, at some point, and the United States does a lot of research. We rely on science to inform our decisions. And there's a place for that. But at some point, you have to recognize and interpret that science and implement it and act accordingly to take corrective measures. And, when you look at how much has been destroyed, our waters in my lifetime, because they were still abundant, my grandfather and others in the community raised a family on subsistence lifeways. My grandfather was a commercial fisherman. One census in 1940 said that he only made $300 a year, and his occupation was listed as commercial fisherman. He had to do a lot of hunting and fishing to feed a family of 5, and our family ate a lot. Kind of renowned for commercial consuming, but within the community. And so, on $300 a year, he relied heavily on subsistence lifeways. He was average hunter and fisherman. And so, in present day, the climate is accelerating some of the impacts of existing impacts on our water bodies. Mashpee, as I said, Masipi, our namesake were named after the river and pond. Mashpee Lake is the third largest lake on Cape Cod. It's the third deepest lake on Cape Cod, and it's second largest, third deepest. And in some areas it's close to 100 feet deep. And so it's spring fed from the ground, and there's no rivers, creeks coming into it. And so we've never had cyanobacteria until 2020. 2020, you had an influx of people that were relocating and isolating to navigate COVID. And that's the point where you see a transition from seasonal life on Cape Cod, where the environment could heal for 3 months over the winter and restore itself. And post 2020, the Aviant is more year-round residency, and the Cape Cod sands infiltrates at such a fast rate, the Title V regulations aren't adequate for Cape Cod sands. They don't factor in Cape Cod sands and the hydrology of the Cape region. And so the cookie cutter approach of government to create laws that are unilaterally applied, the Berkshires is uniquely different than the Cape Cod sands that we have, or even Gloucester and Cape Ann. And so, they need to have regional approaches to regulations based on the geology, hydrology, sedimentation and things, and to effectively address water quality. Our herring and Mashpee and the Quashnet River, Grover Cleveland used to come to Mashpee on a regular basis for fly fishing and hunting and fishing. Mashpee was practicing ecotourism early on. John Adequin was one of the guides that used, a relative that used to take folks that when they came to stay at the Hotel Adequin, he would take them out on hunting and fishing expeditions around the community. And so Mashpee River was known, and Quashnet River as well, was known as a plentiful for brook trout, Yale brook trout. And now they're hard to find in those water bodies. Scallops are pretty much non-existent because the eelgrass is very nitrogen sensitive. And so the nitrogen and phosphorus are killing our waters. Phosphorus is killing the freshwaters, nitrogen killing the bays, and it all stems from the wastewater, lack of wastewater infrastructure. The other thing is the acidification is accelerating eutrophication, as well as the warming of the cold fisheries within our bayments. And so we're seeing the effects of different types of algae blooms that are creating closures for our commercial fishermen and subsistence fishermen as well. And those are some issues that are really challenging our way of life. The other thing, so water contamination is a big one. Sea level rise is another one because they've egregiously built up in Mashpee to a point where Secaucet Island and Mount Muscoy are pretty much at sea level. Their septic systems are septic tanks, or they're cesspools. And so as hydrology happens and sea level rise, where's that going to go? And so we're seeing E. coli breakouts in different areas, and because the houses weren't built to cope. Those houses are legacy houses that were built years ago. And so, those islands are going to be underwater when you look at another 30 years. And some of those houses are going to be right either in the water or at the water's edge. And so we have to start changing our ways and looking at the long-term effects of what we develop today. So as I said, we have been here since time immemorial. So the image on the right is a depiction of, at one point, our oral histories talk about when we could walk out to Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. The map there shows what it may have looked like 10,000 years ago. And so the Cape was much bigger. And then when sea level rise, the Capes changed. And our oral histories and things speak of these times and the changes over the years. We remember the times when the giants walked the land, when everything was bigger, the animals and everything. And there's similarity and consistency throughout Indian country. The Wabanakis speak of Gluskok, Mashpee, and Wampanoags talk of Masha. Out in Ojibwe and the Great Lakes, they talk of Nuna and Busu. They're all giant beings. And so we remember the times when they walked these lands. This image is an image of some of the different Native American villages and tribes within the southeastern Massachusetts area, Wampanoag territory. When you look at Wampanoag territory from a language and cultural perspective, Massachusetts people and Wampanoag people were essentially the same people from a cultural and language perspective. They were different in their governance. Massachusetts people were their own people in governance, and then Wampanoag were separate. But from a language and cultural perspective, they were so similar that you couldn't distinguish them apart. So the boundary of the language-speaking family of Wampanoag, it extends from the Merrimack south to the Cape and Islands, and then the western boundary is the Blackstone River, and everything east of Narragansett Bay is considered a Wampanoag territory, and the same language family, that Elm dialect. So restorative projects, we have a lot of efforts to restore, remove dams. You know, the water bodies are so crucial to us. When I think about the lake, we were swimming the lake to raise awareness to protect Mashpee due to the sino closures that have been happening every year since 2020. And it's roughly a 3-mile swim. Took me about 3 hours, but some of the others 45 minutes. I'm not a fast swimmer. I'll get there though. And so the projects that we're doing, because swimming for 3 hours, you have a lot to think about. And so when I was swimming, I was thinking, you know, this lake has raised our children for generations, and the families, because we can't afford ACs and things, everybody's at the pond and enjoying the pond. You know, and you let your kids run. It was a safe community. Everybody's watching each other's children. And so we spent all of our summers at the pond, and you know, that nurturing relationship, she's always been there and entertained us and nurtured us coming up from a young child. Always look forward to being in the waters of Mashpee. And now, you know, closing it because cyanobacteria is there and it could be harmful to you is something that's unfathomable. But a current reality that really hurts to the core. So some of the projects that are being done, river restorations, everyone's trying to remove the dams. You know, Andromeda's fish rely on those passageways, and so they're critical to the overall ecosystem and part of the overall food chain. And so, you know, if you heal one thing, there's going to be subsequent effects to bring back other things, recognizing that all life is interconnected. And so, water quality is another challenging one. We're doing a lot to try to address those issues. Cranberry bogs. So our folks participated in whaling. Not something we're proud of, but indentured servitude and indebtedness was recognized against us. And so you had a choice when you got to be graduated from the 6th grade, and you could either work for a non-native family. Most every family living in colonial New England had an indentured servant, and it was a contractual relationship where children were bound out through contract to families. And so when our children were coming up, you had a choice, you know, around 6th, 7th grade, you'd go off and have to work to provide and pay off some of the family debt. And so you had a choice, either be a domestic at some family or join the whaling industry. A lot of our men chose whaling, and so they went out. The captains would actually keep the money and then pay the store owners and the people that we owed the debt to, and then give what's remained, the crumbs to the family. And so that was a relationship. But we participated heavily in the whaling industry, and some of our folks, because we could navigate the oceans from the stars, based on our relationships and our with the sea. We ascended to first mate and captain in a lot of instances. And so with that, some of the folks that successfully stayed in the whaling industry made a lot of money at it, some individuals. And they came back and invested in our community. And some of those folks invested in cranberry bogs. So as an industry, cranberry industry supported Mashpee as well as the whaling industry. But the hydrology of our cedar swamps was ideal for cranberry bogs because they need water. So a lot of the cedar swamps were killed off and destroyed, and they built cranberry bogs. The ocean spray cranberry is actually a derivative of the Cape Cod cranberry. The ocean spray made its name and its wealth off of the Cape Cod cranberry. A.D. Makepeace, one of the largest cranberry growers in the country, is the largest landowner in Massachusetts, other than the trustees of reservations. Coastal adaptation, we want to see the swamps, these cranberry bogs, restore the sea swamps. Swamp systems are the most effective filtration mechanism. You can't engineer that. And so they have purpose. And cedars for us are spiritual connected. We use them in ceremony, we use them for lodging, we use them for a lot of different things, medicine even. And so we need more cedars because it's getting harder and harder to find materials to practice our life ways of spirituality and medicine. And so we encourage any projects to, if you're doing a swamp, to try to restore it back to cedar, Atlantic, eastern white cedar. And also being mindful of when you are doing river restoration projects, take the time to do the homework to find out what indigenous plants once grew there as vegetative buffers. Restore those bulrush, sweetgrass, cattails, things like that, so that you try to restore it back to the way it originally was. Importance of tribal engagement. So, there's a lot of stuff going on under the previous administration. There was a lot of efforts to include tribal voice, and so there was different terms like co-stewardship, co-management. Tribes were like, what's that? We don't have to own stuff, so all the time. We just want a voice in how things are managed and things. So we tried to successfully do it, but when the presidential directive, a lot of the agencies we interacted with had no formal mechanism to develop those things. So we didn't actually achieve too much of that under the previous administration. It's something that we're still leaning into because, co-stewardship is something, we're natural stewards of the land. We rely on the land. Yet the decisions that are effectively implemented and discussed around us, our voice isn't at the table. My common theme is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we have to have a voice in decision-making processes. And so, when you think about a body of politics, as I mentioned earlier, Mashpee, you have only 2 federal recognized tribes in the state of Massachusetts, Mashpee and Aquinnah. Yet, at the local level, I successfully got elected onto the Board of Selectmen, but there was about 15 years where there wasn't a tribal voice on this body. The Native American representative was in the composition as it was, in the Cape Cod Commission was created under Mass General laws. It required an African American representative and a Native American representative, so we've had a voice there, but it's not throughout the entirety of the organization. We sit on the decision-making, any developments of regional impact. That's the table I sit at as a commissioner. The tribe's not represented on the assembly of delegates where the Cape Cod Commission has a representative from every one of the 13 towns that comprise the Cape. The tribe doesn't have a voice at that level. And so, we need to relook at the Cape Cod Commission's composition and legislative change that to effectively incorporate our voice into the decision-making authority. And so, at the state level as well, change the composition of the Mass Legislature. Who's representing me? Democracy, as everyone else knows it, is representative, but there's no representation as tribes. We don't have a voice, yet we're a higher body of politic than the local municipalities that sometimes are surrounding us, the county, the state, based on trust responsibilities. And, the other thing is at a state level, Massachusetts is as one of the original colonial states, has carried a lot of influence throughout the years. They still have a lot of clout. And so Massachusetts and Indian policy developed based on Massachusetts practice, and yet they didn't adhere to the Constitution. We claimed that we're, morally higher than a lot of others and pride ourselves on the foundings of this country and the history that goes along with that. Yet Massachusetts was malfeasant in inserting authority over the Indians of Mashpee and the other Indian communities in the Commonwealth after the Constitution of the United States was implemented. In the Constitution, it states that the plenary power lies with Congress, and only Congress, through the Non-Intercourse Act, has the authority to regulate and do commerce with the Indians or sell off Indian resources. So the state in all of its activities, when they incorporated the District of Mashpee, which was a reservation before they started using the term reservations, and extinguishing us by paper through the Act of 1869 and subsequent incorporation of Mashpee in 1870, they were malfeasant in asserting authority over the tribes based on trust, responsibility, and the sovereign nation, being tribal entities being sovereign nations. And so the federal government was non-feasant in asserting and protecting the Mashpees or other Native Americans in colonial New England as well. And so with that, you know, at what time do you recognize that Massachusetts was a beneficiary of all that was lost, those land grabs? And so shouldn't the trust responsibility that the federal government is now being asked to uphold? You didn't honor the Constitution when you were taking on land, but now that we've achieved federal recognition, now the trust responsibility is solely with the federal government and nothing at the state level. The state should also have that same trust responsibility because they were the beneficiaries of all that was lost. So we're trying to work with NEPA and different state agencies and federal agencies to try to elevate the tribe's voice. So as a historic preservation officer, part of my delegated responsibilities are interact on projects and consult. Consultation is something that's done on any projects that receive state, federal funding, or regulatory authority is imposed over them. You know, in those projects, I have a voice typically, but there's local projects that also have impacts. And so, you know, there's no mechanism there to threshold for me to advocate and get my voice into those projects. That's something that we need to look at. But, you know, with that, we bring this history and knowledge and relationship to all those conversations. We think about the future generations. We don't think of ourselves. And so that's kind of some of the things that the importance of tribal engagement is bringing our voice in and incorporating it intentionally. These are just some historic pictures. You know, up until 1830, this gentleman's a traditional fish net, where a dip net that would be a long lever, and you would swing it out over the river and then lift it, and you would be able to swing your herring up on the bank. These baskets were all handcrafted by different basket makers in Mashpee. Some early pictures of one of the one-room schoolhouses in the classroom in the class. Some Native American children and families as well. Up until the 1850s, 50% of the homes were still wigwams. Non-natives wouldn't come into Mashpee and build stick frame construction for whatever reason, up until the mid-1850s. So some of our earliest structures, we're trying to restore a structure now that was built in 1834. It was connected to the church. And so they were selective as to who they built houses for. And so there aren't a lot of homes that date back further than the 1800s. The meeting house is one of them. It's the oldest structure in Mashpee. Like I said, co-stewardship, co-management is something that's very important to us. As a tribal government, we have our organizational structure. We have a lot of different departments and programs. We rely, currently we're 85% grant driven, so we rely heavily on federal funds and state funds. Chasing grants is the lifestyle, but we're always subject to the ebb and flow of appropriations. And so it's challenging. We like to try to create relationships and collaborative projects to work together on shared interests and concerns. And, you know, from a non-tribal perspective, we do successfully bring in millions and millions of dollars to the region through the grant writing efforts that we do. So some of the funders actually really like collaborative projects. You know, having a tribe involved is oftentimes beneficial to the project. And the tribe likes it because then we can have a voice in those. And so looking at co-stewardship, co-management relationships is important. Mashpee, we're geographically far from Cape Ann, but you know, we're always willing to support things and try to offer input and like to have a voice. Partnerships and things are something that the overall organization, we have Natural Resources Department, Health and Human Services Department, Transportation Department, Building and Roads and Grounds, Child Development, Education, Language. We have our own school where we're restoring our language, teaching our little children. Historic Preservation, we have our tribal museum, our archives, everything related to preservation. Under my program, we also have NAG program, where we interact with institutions like the Peabody and things and try and get our ancestors returned and repatriated and reinterred into the ground. We also have our food pantry, we have our tribal court based on our jurisdictional authority. We have our exercise our own formal court with Supreme Court judge, and all the other tiers of justices. And then we have our finance department, administrative, the tribal council. The way we're set up, we have tribal operations that try to provide the services and programs to our tribal membership. Our housing department's an important one, and then nutrition program feeds our elders. Our enrollment manages our enrollment practices and retains the data associated with that. And then Indian Child Welfare Act is another important one to try to keep Native Americans that may go through the foster care system within the Indian homes. And then I'm sure I'm missing some of the programs. Tribal Employee Rights Ordinance ensures Indian preference and advocates for that. And then we have our own tribal police department to police ourselves. And so we have our legislative body, which is the tribal council. We have our operations, and then we have our justice, judicial branch of the tribal government. And then we have the police and our traditional form of governance that is also incorporated into each of those mechanisms. Spiritual ties. When the Indian Removal Act was implemented, they looked at us. The Morris Report captures that, Mashpee people and Native Americans within our community were essential to the local economy. And so because we were so essential to the local economy, the surrounding communities advocated and said, you can't remove the Mashpees because the impacts would be too great to our economy. And so in the Morris Report, it says that if we were to remove the Mashpees from their lands, we think they would die. And so they're critical to the local economy. They're so reliant upon the oceans. They once referenced us as the South Sea Indians before calling us the Mashpees. It was a term used collectively for the Indian communities within the Upper Cape and Mid Cape region. But in our spirituality, there are spirits that are part of everything. The ocean, Pampakusa, the spirit of the sea. The moon, the stars are spirits that we communicate with and practice in our ceremonies. We keep our ears open, our hearts open to be able to receive what the messages they're telling us. Our relationship to the animals is that if we rely on those things and they're within our surrounding areas, then we have to be a voice for the things that don't have voices. So we have a moral and cultural obligation to speak up for the trees, the waters, the plants, every being. And so, that interconnectedness that I talked about is incorporated into our spirituality, our governance, our way of life. Everything that we do, we don't segment things the way that non-native societies do, where everything is interconnected. The spirituality, culture, traditions, lifeways is all a part of what we do on a daily basis and should be factored into every decision. The premise around land, though, is that, when we die, we have to be buried in our homelands or we won't transition to our relatives on the other side. And it's because that if you ate from the land and live, when I introduce myself and say, New Tomas, I'm a part of Mashpee, I'm from Mashpee, I'm a part of Mashpee. Mashpee is a part of my DNA because I eat and drink from the waters of Mashpee. And so that's the relationship to the land. It's your mother, it's your life giver. If your environment isn't healthy, then you're not healthy. So that brings me to the close, and I just want to say, as Native Americans, we recognize and assert the rights of nature in our worldly view, understanding that all living things have the right to thrive in a healthy way. And if our shared environment isn't healthy, then we are not healthy, because we are interdependent on one another. When we restore a river, a pond, or a lake, we restore life. When we protect the coast, we honor the lifeways of our ancestors and our sacred teachings, and their reliance on those spaces, and ensure them for future generations. Our ceremonies are conducted in relationship with these places to take care of them, not just practical or extractive. I'd like to thank, in closing, I want to express my deep gratitude to the Interfaith Committee of the Cape Ann Climate Coalition and to St. Paul Lutheran Church for hosting this gathering. Your work to protect coastal environments and ecosystems is not just admirable, it's essential. Thank you for creating space for Indigenous voices and for walking this path of care and responsibility together. Thank you. Did anyone have questions?
I was so thorough.
Thank you so much, David. Anyone with questions? We're going into the undercroft and we're having cranberry crumble and ice fusion. And why don't you approach David down there?